Good evening, everybody, and welcome to H15, the Club PRiMi, where we're doing yet another of my legendary network talks. This is sponsored by Autor, a wonderful composer organization, and it's a series that's been going on for at least 3 years. And the idea is to have a conversation with some of the different important artists in our town, and sometimes people passing through, to hear about their thoughts about music and hear about how they make everything work in their lives as a musician, composer, and so on. And I'm extremely happy to welcome today the great Carolyn Goodwin. Let's give her a big hand, Carolyn. We're going to be covering a lot of the different aspects of your art today. We only have 45 minutes, but I want to go through the whole thing, and also there should be a possibility for you in the audience to ask a question. So if you feel like breaking on through to the other side, raise your hand, and then you're very welcome to ask me or Carolyn some questions. But maybe we should start with the beginning. I'm very interested in hearing how did music enter your life?
Mm-hmm. Well, I come from Cork, a city in Ireland, and I started, I guess, in my family. It was my father. He's probably the person who made that happen for me, because he was well, he's not a professional musician himself, but he almost is now, because he retired about 5 years ago and is now doing music almost full time. But when he was, he had 5 kids, right? And we were all brought to music lessons and things like that when we were younger. But he played a lot of music in my home. So, he had like a record player with like a huge collection, and every Saturday night would put on some like Pink Floyd records or something while he was like painting the walls or doing some DIY. So, and he had some nice speakers out in the hallway as well, so it was kind of in the whole house. Mm-hmm. So it kind of created this like backdrop. And also car journeys with him, where he would have all of his records that he had put onto tape. So he would make his own compilation tapes that we would hear like on repeat for long road trips. So I think that was like, kind of setting the tone. And then, I started having some piano lessons as a kid. And, from there, eventually there was a band in the town, like a harmony orchestra, I think they call it in Denmark. Mm-hmm. So he decided that he had never played an instrument before, but he wanted to start, so he went down there and found out that he could get a tuba. So,
your father?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he started playing tuba, and then he came to us and asked if any of us wanted to play, and my brother started playing euphonium, and and then I got a clarinet. And that band, like, we had rehearsals twice a week from like the age of, I was maybe 9 when I started, until like I was 18. I would go to that community band twice a week with my dad and my brother in the car. And so every Wednesday night and every Sunday morning before Mass.
Okay. So it's deeply integrated in your family life
it was kind of part of the family routine to just get in the car twice a week and go to this rehearsal. Mm-hmm. And and that was also a place where I met a lot of friends, of course, and It was quite like it kind of fed a lot of, it was a satellite town of Cork where I grew up. So it was kind of like, I don't know, Vidar of... Vidar, yeah. Maybe that kind of like almost on the cusp of, I think it's where Martin lives, on the cusp of the countryside.
Okay.
But luckily enough, there was a city close by, and there was a music conservatory there, and they had a big band. So the first time I heard the big band, then I was like, no, I want to play the saxophone. And I got my hands on a saxophone when I was 15. And
was it a tenor?
Alto.
Alto, yeah.
Yeah. And then I started playing alto saxophone. And actually that became kind of my primary instrument. And I went to the music conservatory in Cork, where I studied saxophone as my primary instrument, but it was classical saxophone actually. So, but Cork is one of those cities that, like, I mean, just on reflection of the kind of career I had in the beginning, it's like, it's small enough that all of the musicians kind of have to do everything or get to dabble in all genres. So even though I was studying classical music, I started playing in a Motown cover band, and I started also singing jazz standards with some other people, and at some point I was in a Steely Dan tribute band playing horns, like, so yeah, I mean, in some ways it's kind of diluted because you kind of touch on a lot of things, but I suppose on reflection it meant that I was always, I mean, I can see now that I'm quite curious about, like, just culture and different kinds of people, and being in a music scene that was that kind of eclectic was actually great exposure to many kind of branches that I've ended up continuing with and to this day. So
was there a point where you suddenly realized that this was serious?
Yeah, I think so. I think after I'd been playing the saxophone for about a month, I was just like, okay, yeah, because I think the clarinet was actually, I don't know, maybe my hands are kind of big, so I found it kind of an awkward instrument, and it didn't actually come that naturally to me, that instrument, so I didn't really feel like I had found my thing, but I was happy that I was, playing music with other people and stuff. But when I had that instrument, it just felt like things kind of fell into place, and even when I went back to other instruments after playing that one, it felt like it came more naturally because I had found kind of the thing that gave me, I don't know, the flow or like feeling of being on top of it. I was able to operate it better. So yeah.
And so you studied classical saxophone and played in all kinds of situations, and you were done with your studies when you were in your early 20s?
Yeah, I mean, that's the difference between Denmark and Ireland as well, like you leave school like gymnasium, and then you go straight into education, and you do your bachelor and you do your master's, and then you start working, that's kind of, tends to be the thing, which means that people are already starting their music careers like in their very early 20s. So yeah.
So it was just a smooth transition from being in school to becoming a professional, or did you make like specific choices when you stopped school?
It was a smooth transition. I mean, like I said, it's a small enough place that if you are kind of able to, if you've got some chops or some skills, then you're already, like, I was already kind of working in professionally even while I was in school, actually, while I was still studying. So yeah. So and then you left. At some point, you decided to leave Ireland. Yeah, but I mean, I left Ireland when I was 29, 30.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, I was like quite a big part of that Cork music scene for some years actually, and then I moved to Dublin for a couple of years before moving to Scandinavia to study. Yeah.
But why did you move to Scandinavia?
Yeah, so I because I had been working with creative music, or started to work more with improvisation, and I kind of had this like feeling of that there was something missing. That I had all this like kind of very formal training with classical thing, but hadn't really been in like very creative music making environments. So I wanted to, just go back into a kind of a safe setting and see if I could make improvisation more part of what I was doing. So I started to research some programs and came across one that was kind of a joint masters between the Sibelius Academy in Finland and the Jyske Musikkonservatorium in Aarhus.
Okay.
So I did this 2-year master program where I spent half a year in Helsinki, and then I went to Aarhus, and then I went to Mali in West Africa. That was my choice because part of this, the program was to dig into music culture outside of your own that was interesting to you. So I went to Mali and I studied balafon there for like half a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did that give you? Did you bring something of that into your own music, or was it just a nice 6 months in Bali? Mali, sorry.
It's okay. 6 months in Bali sounds more like working remotely, but no, it was Mali. It was it gave me a lot. I guess my kind of motivation for learning the balafon was that I wanted to learn an instrument that was, already in the music culture there. So I went and I just got lessons every day from somebody, and he, we didn't have the same language, so it was just, learning by seeing and watching and listening, and I'd never done that before, like it's like, I guess, how folk music works and how, jazz music worked, so this kind of thing of just copying and repeating and, recording something and going home and trying it out and coming back and like building from there every day. And it was also, a chance for me to play an instrument that was just so different from what I had been doing for many years, and a lot of the kind of rhythmic patterns I was really into, kind of finding trying to find the one and realizing there was no one, or
that's deep.
It's deep.
That's very deep.
Or learning something and feeling like you had the groove, and then you go and your teacher starts tapping his foot and you're like, shit, but it was nice to be a complete beginner on something as well. And I think it's found its way into the music I'm making now. I think for this clarinet choir project I have, for example, there's a lot of kind of like cyclical things or repetitive patterns. I kind of like repetition, I think. So, and I liked the fact that you could sit and play one like pattern for a really, really, really long time, because that's something I realized in Mali, was that the kind of concept of time there is different. And even if you go to a concert, one tune can like just last an hour, and that's just normal. And I played some shows there with some Malian bands, not on balafon because I wasn't, my chops weren't there yet, but I had brought my horns with me and played some gigs there, and it was just like, stamina and all those things, like it's just a different thing. It goes much, much longer, and getting really deep into one pattern for a really long time. I kind of got into that there, I think, and that's kind of shows up a bit now in some of the stuff that I'm writing. Yeah.
So now you're here in Denmark, and you're quite established on the scene here, and you are working in many very different projects and different bands. Can you tell us a little bit about the scope of the work you're doing right now? Like what the different projects represent to you, and what you try to achieve artistically?
Okay, that's a big question.
I know, yeah.
Well, I'll just talk about the project that I've been working on most in the last while, because I think that kind of maybe is defining where I am artistically now. And that's this Copenhagen Clarinet Choir that I started a couple of years ago. And I think my motivation for that was maybe I was kind of missing this being in a wind section that was kind of harmonious in terms of not having a kind of a front person or a soloist, but more like feeling like a collective entity of like, yeah. So to explain, I write like lines that we play as a group. So we have a kind of a fixed frame, but then it's also kind of embellished, but always for the greater good of the overall sound, rather than having one personality coming to the fore. And I guess it's quite egalitarian in that way, and I think I was kind of missing that actually sometimes in the improv scene, especially when you get together as a lot of horn players, that there tends to be more about kind of coming to the front or some person stepping forward all the time, and I kind of was missing this feeling of like creating like a harmonious sound together. So that was kind of what led me into writing for that group. And so that's, I think, artistically what I'm maybe aiming for is to get a more of a kind of a collected sound, because I mean, I've been in lots of situations where we're like different instruments and you're finding your own space within that, but I was kind of missing this kind of like unified thing. So I don't know, I think quite often when you're missing something, then you just try and create the environment yourself, or you feel like you need to do it yourself in order for it to happen. Yeah.
Does it have to be those specific people in the choir, or is it a concept that can have anyone playing the clarinet? Just as like I'm asking because I'm trying to find out where the difference is between whether you compose a concept or an idea, or you're coming more from the traditional, like the jazz place where each person has his or her sound. Their sound,
yeah. So I guess it's the first one, but that's not to say that the people in it are like disposable or interchangeable. One of them is here, so.
Oh yeah, watch out.
No, but I think it's also about knowing that there's sensitivity in the players, or the kind of level of listening that you're after, and that's certainly like something that was, I guess that you end up curating with the people that you invite to join a thing. So I think I think it's actually both those things.
Both those things.
Yeah.
Would you like object to being called a jazz musician, or do you feel that is a term that describes where you're coming from?
I think that's like an interesting thing, because I was just writing an email last night to Sam Newsom, the saxophone player. So I was in New York 2 weeks ago, and I met up with him because I just reached out to him because I really respect him and admire him, and he's also written some really good books about being a musician. Not necessarily, I mean, his book about it's called Notes from Behind the Horn. So he's writing from a wind player perspective, but I would say that he's also just writing about, you know, being a musician and what his values are and things. And I could really relate to them. So we met up and we played together, and then I gave him a copy of my record with the Clarinet Choir, and he actually wrote to me yesterday and asked me if I could send him on some scores. And that was really nice, because I thought, okay, he's like, yeah, I've been listening to this every day and I really want to see what you've written down. And then I kind of, when I was writing back, I said, I feel in some ways a little bit embarrassed, because, not embarrassed, but like, it was just like those scores are so short, they're so concise, and there's not much in them. And and he said he wanted to listen to the music and look at the scores together. So then, but when I sent it to them, I hadn't done that myself actually maybe ever. I just sat with the record and then looked at my score and kind of, you know, kind of thought from the eyes of somebody else looking at this, like, what would they think about these choices that happen in the music? Because so much happens that's not written down, you know. But then at the same time, that's not to say that the music isn't still very kind of dictated by what's there. And I kind of was explaining to him this, and I kind of felt like, I guess in a way, the reason why I don't write everything down is because I'm a jazz musician. So I want to be able to have everybody feel that they're free to do things, and I also want to be free to change my mind in every performance or in every context. So the more that gets put on the page, the less I feel like a jazz musician. So I mean, that felt like, I didn't normally say that, but I kind of wrote in this email to him, I guess the reason why I haven't written down the stuff is because it makes me anxious sometimes, and I look at it, but then I realized it's because I'm a jazz musician.
So you wrote it in italics?
Yes. Block capital letters, like, I'm a jazz musician. But I mean, a friend of mine will also tell you a story about the time where I turned to her with tears in my eyes saying, I think I'm a folk musician, you know. I was on Feino at the time, so I will blame the fact that I was on Feino. There was something in the air there.
That can change a person.
It can change a person.
But you know, I've spoken to many jazz musicians who say that jazz music is folk music.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole very heavy Irish tradition of the jam session, the folk jam sessions. I have even in Cork myself been to several of those jam sessions where an old man came up to me and gave me the bones, and I had to play the bones, and it was a whole thing. And I'm wondering, like, is that at all any part of you? Like, do you feel that, or does that exist within you, that world?
Definitely. I mean, I think Irish people are improvisers, you know.
Right.
We really are. If I compare it to, and it's not, you know, because Denmark has some incredible improvisers. But I think as a society, we're improvisers. Like in our homes, we're improvising. You know, like in the sense that we don't kind of find one uniform way of doing things. Like we don't follow recipes, or we're just a little bit more like loose. And I think. And you mentioned, you know, Irish folk music, and I mean that has improvisation in it, like the ornamentation, for example, like is improvised, you know, and you can tell who's from where by the, you know, the improvisations how much improvisation they do and how much ornamentation they put in. So there's a lot of like personality kind of gets expressed through that music. So I think in a way, that's also important to me. There's this kind of like narrative, like also storytelling is a big thing, and it's a skill, you know. It's like they actually have competitions in Ireland for telling stories, like, you know, well-known storytellers will come and they're like celebrities, and they're good at just, you know, putting the narrative in such a way that it twists and turns and takes you on little journeys and little sidetracks and things like that. Well,
the Atlantic is right there. I mean, in a way, I always think about, when I think about Danish culture. It's such a transitional place. Like geographically, it's just
true.
like it's something you pass through to go from Europe to Scandinavia, and the geography is so flat, and I think that's why Danish culture is full of compromises between North German folk tradition and Scandinavian folk tradition, whereas in Ireland, you have this island with a lot of wind and rain and rocks and stuff, and then there's like the Atlantic is right there, and it's just there's another kind of adventure right in your face.
And there's parts of the west of Ireland where like in some ancient cultures they believed that was the edge of the earth, like that was where it stopped. So I guess if you're kind of I don't know, maybe that pushes you to kind of an extreme as well, mentally.
I'd like to stay a little bit with this whole jazz musician thing, because your career has been very, then you've played in a kind of a pop band where you also sing. Then you've been sideman with Bon Iver, which is a very specific job. And then you've done all this writing for theater and for dance. In what, do you have different attitudes about your musical values when you change between these very different worlds, or is there some kind of core set of values that you bring with you into all these different situations, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, there's certain places where the creative process can come to the fore, and then your own creative process, and then there's other situations where you're working creatively in a group, and then there's situations where you're serving somebody else's maybe vision. I don't know, you just mentioned the Bon Iver thing, and of course that was not... I wasn't part of a creative process there, right? So that's a different thing, and then it is difficult actually, because your values do kind of have to adjust sometimes, and maybe in some ways that's why when you ask me big questions about my overall artistic career, I kind of feel like it has been like twisting and turning, and I think the values are starting to get stronger as I get older, and maybe are starting to kind of feel more like they are like fælles.
Common,
yeah. Sometimes Danish words are better. Common. So, and actually I feel that it did exhaust me for a while to kind of feel that I was adjusting, so yeah, I'm working on it. I'm working on trying to have this core set be as strong as possible, so that it feels unfaltering, but it's a challenge, I think. Yeah.
Do you guys have any comments or questions or things you want to bring into this conversation?
I have a question. Because we talked for a long time ago about the difference between the clarinet and the saxophone, and you said it was nice to have a choir in the clarinet setting. But you also play with some other saxophonists, but then you're only 3 people, and that would be the maximum for that instrument?
Yeah, very strict with numbers. So the question was
when we talked at that time, you mentioned that you kind of change your personality a little bit when you play the clarinet compared to when you're a saxophone.
Yeah, I think maybe what you're referencing is that in this Copenhagen Clarinet Choir, the majority of us all play saxophone as well, and actually for most of us, saxophone is the primary instrument. So maybe there's something as well about taking your second instrument, and yeah, I mean, there are strong players in that group, and who are all very soloistic. And as you asked, Kresten, like, is it then because, you asked me if, what was that question about?
Personality, or you're more humble
Yeah, are
when
you
play the
like
clarinet?
choosing?
Could they be switched around?
Yeah, could they be switched around? But maybe it felt that like that side of those strong artistic voices could also be, I don't want to say the word muted because that kind of almost sounds like you're pressing something down, but it's a little bit more contained, maybe. I think the sound of the instrument as well is like, it's softer, and it's in some ways maybe not what, like when you hear different saxophone players, you can really hear the sound is more flexible, so you can really hear the voices of each person. I think with the clarinet, it's maybe a little bit easier to find a uniform sound, which is what makes the blend of that group work really well. And I think, maybe I wouldn't have expected the same thing to work if all of us were playing saxophone, because then these personalities would kind of have to find their space more.
We also know that sound a little more, maybe, like the saxophone.
That's true.
Ensemble is more the tested territory. Yeah,
I mean, the idea when I first also thought about all of those reed instruments was just the idea of an organ, and then I thought about the organ as being just an instrument where it's like one person playing by themselves, and quite often they're alone, they're kind of up in the church, like with their back to everybody, and so it's a very kind of like intimate space. And so I tried to imagine what that would feel like if we were an ensemble, like with one hand pressing on the keys and then like changing one note like very slowly, so it became like a kind of a minimalistic kind of aesthetic. Which is quite cool, actually, that I'm writing a piece now for the Organ Festival in Concertkirchen for the ensemble, and the idea is that I'm trying to kind of like re-embody the organ in the ensemble, but I'm still always kind of trying to imagine that it's one player in some ways, or one brain operating the whole thing.
Will there be an organ playing with the ensemble? Okay, so the ensemble will sound like an organ, or be an organ.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, on the simplest term is like, yes, this is like reeds, and it's, but it's also just this idea of one person operating the instrument, is something that I think about a lot when I'm now writing for this group. So.
I think one of the big open questions happening in music in our time is the relationship between improvisation and composition. And I think those two things bleed into each other very much. And I feel that people are less prepared to rely on improvisation now than they were just 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Okay. It seems like composition, and this is not relating to, I'm not talking about your work, I'm more like, just in general, I'm curious about what you think about this premise I'm setting up, that it seems like things are going in a direction where improvisers want to validate their ideas by composing. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I feel like there are two strong fields in my mind of both, just like improvisers being improvisers, and then improvisers being band leaders. And I guess when you're a band leader, in some way you're a composer, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're writing a score in the traditional way of composition, but that you are taking like even personalities and putting them in one room together, and that in itself is a kind of a form of composition.
Right, exactly.
And that can obviously go into deeper levels when you do bring material and stuff. But I mean, I don't know. I've been kind of trying to think about other ways of being a, if you want to say, band leader, of like bringing people in a room together without saying that I'm a composer. But what happens when you like think about, for example, like contemporary dance companies or physical theatre companies who like meet regularly and do like exercises together that can kind of free them to create material as a group, and in my mind that's also kind of like a way of composing, like a way of kind of directing something, or being an outside orchestrator.
Because the minute you introduce an idea, a fixed idea into an improvised field, then it becomes composition.
Yes, it does. But I don't know if it's like a dichotomy, you know.
What does that mean?
Like as in like
either or.
So I mean, I don't really have the overview of, in the last 10 years the scene has changed. Like for me it feels like in Copenhagen, for example, there's as strong as like completely free improv scene as there are people composing in the context of improvised music. So I don't know. I'm not sure. Like it's not absolutely.
Oh yeah, totally. But it's actually interesting to hear your perspective on the scene here, because you are in a unique position to kind of compare it to the other place you came from. Like, can you say anything about like what's happening here? How you see this scene that you're now a part of? What makes it special?
Yeah, I think what is special about it is the fact that so many people are actually into improvisation, regardless of kind of their background. So it's not like limited to those who've come from like the traditional jazz background. And I've spoken to people in other parts of Europe about that as well. And the kind of perception of Copenhagen is that there's a very strong kind of like intersection between classical musicians playing with improvisers. So for me that's kind of exciting, because that in a way makes sense for me with my background and where I'm coming from as well. So it hasn't felt like I was trying to find my own. I guess that's maybe why I left Ireland, that there wasn't that kind of, it was a bit more kind of separated, like those working very creatively with music were very separated from those who'd come up in a classical tradition. So I meet a lot of people who've got a classical background here who are now working in, you know, a lot of very creative fields and still have that kind of formal training behind them. So I think that's really exciting and fits me.
Also, a lot of the people who are doing like the rock gigs and the singer-songwriter gigs are all jazz musicians, so have some kind of jazz background. Or seems like it's just I guess you're right. It is very there's a kind of freedom that kind of spills into all the different genres, and people can work with each other.
And I think improvisation in general actually is more accepted here than it is like in a broader sense than it is from my background in terms of like Irish culture versus Danish culture, because funnily enough, even though I said that thing about Irish people being improvisers in their kind of daily life, I think when it comes to music, I think Irish people really want to be part of something, so they want to feel like something's been really shared with them, and sometimes that's always also about kind of very direct communication to an audience and things like that. And you know, I mean, for people outside of, you know, especially with free improvised music, people outside of that, it can sometimes feel like it's, you know, a bit insular for the musicians playing it. And I mean, I don't feel that obviously, but it's nice to be in a culture where there isn't that expectation of you should play for the audience first.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because I always had this thought that, you know, free improvisation, it's a global phenomenon, like it's happening all over the world, and improvisation is happening, has many different you know, functions and ways of being played all over the world, but at the same time it's extremely regional. I would say even there's a big difference between how people improvise in Aalborg as opposed to how they improvise in Malmö or Copenhagen.
Yeah.
And if you go take the nations, it's even more like when you said what you just said about how the Irish the relationship between the musicians and the audience, and what's the level of abstraction you can kind of be allowed to have without losing the faith or whatever. Like, for instance, English free improvisation, you know, which is, as we know, a very strong direction. That was always to me like a kind of a counterculture phenomenon, like kind of being done in as an opposition to British society. Whereas the way people were improvising in some of the more like pan-European countries, it came from a totally different place. Like in Germany, it came from an art place. It was an extension of an already existing art movement, which it really isn't in England the same way. It was much more like some guys that just wanted to mess with the whole thing. So that is, I mean, and here you could talk forever about what free improvisation means here, but I guess somehow it's linked to the sociological situation here that we can afford to be abstract.
It's interesting to, you know, to look at cultures and see how improvisation has been received, or how it's already kind of integrated. Like, I remember when I was studying in Finland, I came across the kantele, which is this kind of like a bit like a dulcimer kind of instrument, and like that's a very old instrument, and it's to be played solo, and it's like there's no pieces written for it, it's just improvised. And you know, I remember hearing about the tradition that it was just like, you know, Finland, you've got nobody for, I don't know, 20 kilometers or something to the next house, and you know, so you're just by yourself and you're playing for hours and hours. And I was just thinking that, like, you wouldn't be allowed to do that in Ireland. Like, somebody would be like, he's been gone like a half an hour, like, can you go and check if he's okay?
What's all this
and
then?
And then you'd be like, can you come out of your room and take that instrument up here, and if you're going to play something, at least play it for us, you know? Like, and it's just like, okay, but I mean, Finnish culture is pretty different in that sense. It's just like, okay, just go and be on your own, you know. So it's definitely an interesting way of kind of learning about a culture, actually. To maybe that could be a good research topic, just to like an ethnographical thing of going to different places and seeing how improvisation is kind of how it's perceived, or how. Let's
apply for some money to do that. I'm sure we can get some funding, and then when we have the funding, then we can start the work, but not until we're sure we have the funding together. It's very important.
Yes.
I would like to ask you out here, what time is it? Because I've completely lost track of time.
23 past 8.
Okay.
That means that this interview is reaching its end, because we have today a very exciting music program, and I'm so happy you guys are here, because this is going to be a really really special night with amazing music happening. So I think we should say thank you to Carolyn Goodwin for this. Really, really nice, really great to hear your thoughts and feelings about music.
Thanks. Yeah,
so thank you, Carolyn.
Thanks for listening.